You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
I was always a bit of a childhood techie, particularly on the hardware side. Dints started in 2005 as a partnership in the UK and then as a company in 2007. Some of the projects we work on in the mining space and construction are in very remote locations. So I think there are some practical problems. If you base your business on its success is if people copy what you're doing, then you save yourself a lot of time and energy. Access cheaper funding, and by doing so create many more jobs in the community is not the whole solution for the challenge, but it's certainly a step in the right direction.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have Geoffrey de Mowbray, who is CEO of ViaTrade and Dints International. ViaTrade enables trade by digitising several aspects of the supply chain and bringing together customers and suppliers via a financial solution, and Dints International is a supplier to mining construction industries. Welcome to the podcast, Geoffrey. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I think we've tried to organise this a few times, and each time we speak, you're travelling to somewhere exotic.
Well, yes, trying to get things going. And, without a doubt, the key to being in trading internationally is to be present in local markets. So I'm lucky I love the travel, but yes, it's quite demanding at times.
As always, I like to start from the beginning. So I was hoping you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Geoffrey de Mowbray.
Sure. So I'm British, born in England, but child to expat kids. So I grew up all around the world. My father worked for the British government and my mother for the United Nations. I think I was always someone who struggled a little bit at school. I mean, I was reasonably bright, but I just wasn't very good at school. And I remember even in playgrounds trading, whether it's cards or snap bracelets or things.
Yes.
From a very early age, it was kind of clear that I suppose, did things a little bit differently. And when I got to my late teen years, I was a little bit lost, and there was the direction of going to university or to carrying on. And as I sort of mentioned, school and I didn't work that well together. And despite my dad particularly being quite upset, I chose not to go to university. And I tried a couple of jobs, and to be honest, I'm not very employable, and none of them particularly worked out well. But when I was 18, my parents moved to Cameroon, and I was always a bit of a childhood techie, particularly on the hardware side. And when I first got to Cameroon, I started teaching at l'Institut de l'Africain de l'Informatique, the African Institute of IT, which this was back in 2000. And, I started seeing the opportunities and the interest and growth on the continent. And I suppose to cut a sort of long story short, during that time I was there, I was met by quite a powerful emotion, sort of seeing a lot of poverty in the country, but also a lot of wealth beneath the ground or in their resources. And I was quite pained with the disparity of wealth. And it was fantastic seeing everything through the eyes of the United Nations doing good things. But my view is, especially with Africa really being a continent of entrepreneurs, harnessing and giving people the ability to trade and to trade on sort of equal terms was a way to drive sustainable development. So I think it's that vision that got me into setting up my early businesses and the business we run today. And my passion really, and I suppose my life's purpose, is really purposeful profit, doing business that benefits all concerned. Little bit about me personally, I guess. I live in the UK. I travel a lot, which I love. And my hobbies, I fly a little plane. That's my kind of hobby. I think we spoke about that before. And I kite surf a little bit. But really, what I love most is seeing new opportunities and mentoring business people to be the best they can be. And as I said, do business with purpose.
Thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned you have an entrepreneurial spirit since you were young, trading cards, did things differently, moved to Cameroon and saw the opportunities on the continent, which has brought you to where you are. So you've shared your passion behind why you've started ViaTrade and Dints. What's the journey been like behind that motivation?
Longer than I expected. I think that's the way of summarising it. I think, back then I was thinking, yeah, we can make all of this happen. And part of that has been things take longer than you expect, but also you're relying on market dynamics and things changing and people being ready. So Dints started originally in 2005 as a partnership in the UK and then as a company in 2007. And very simply, it supplies goods and services, predominantly machinery, parts, and financing into mining and construction companies. What we were really learning and still are learning through doing this is the challenges and opportunities of trading cross-border and particularly selling into Africa. So the challenges can be that of logistics, that can be of the market dynamics, sometimes transparency isn't what it needs to be, getting paid, all of those aspects of trade, finding customers and keeping those relationships. So all of those aspects of trade, we've kind of been doing and living and been reasonably successful at doing over the last 17 or more years. And, ViaTrade is very much on the beginning of its journey, although it's always been part of the original vision. And just to explain a little bit about Via, it's actually kind of means Latin for the way or the road. And it's also an acronym that my mother always used to describe me as a child, which is vision, insight, and affection. Now we've kind of moved that to vision, insight, and automation in our business. But really, Via is at the beginning of its journey, although at the forefront of my vision 20 years ago, which is to take all of our experience and distill it using technology to, I suppose, democratize international trade across the world, but particularly in Africa, to allow companies to trade without the barriers of language, finance, accessibility, to make it easier for everyone to, run their businesses. And yeah, we're at the beginning of our journey there, and there's very much more a technology-focused play.
So you slightly touched on this regarding the challenges around logistics, transparency in doing trade in Africa. So I was hoping we could go into a bit more detail regarding why do you believe these solutions are needed on the continent?
Yeah, that's a good question. I suppose the simple answer would be if they weren't needed, we wouldn't be in business. And if we had all of the solutions that we needed, we wouldn't need to create anything new. But, if you look at the continent of Africa, and still far too many people refer to, it's so different in different regions and such a vast territory. But, on a logistics front, very tricky terrain still. And to be clear, things have improved vastly in the last 20 years, but there still are challenges. And there's challenges at borders. Part of this is, because such large investment and projects are happening, some ports are overwhelmed, but it's unfortunately not like Europe or the US or other parts of the world today where you can order something online and seamlessly get it in, the next day or in a couple of days' time. And some of the projects we work on in the mining space and construction are in very remote locations. So I think there are some practical problems. There's streamlining and bureaucratic problems. And, unfortunately, and it's something we never get involved in, but unfortunately, the transparency isn't always there, which I kind of, it's again, one of my pet projects that I'd love to solve it or help solve at some point in life, because I do believe that comes from the lack of opportunity elsewhere. But I think logistically, it can be a challenge. I think financially wise, regardless of where you are in the world, if you're extending credit to people who are not in the same country as you and sometimes don't speak the language, it's hard to collect those funds sometimes. And also in the context, and I know this from being an entrepreneur myself, sometimes communication isn't always as good as it is. And I think this is the problem the world over. When people do run into problems, sometimes people find it hard to be honest about that. And so you get ghosted, I suppose, a little bit on that. And I think that's a lot of the challenge that people find. But I always find it interesting that the default rates in Africa, I believe, are actually statistically lower than they are in Europe, which is amusing. I hope I've answered your question, or at least in part, but I think a lot of the challenges lie in the fact that it is such a buoyant and dynamic market, and obviously there's some countries more buoyant than others, and so much going on that there's perhaps a little bit of what I would describe as K-order, or a chaotic approach. So there is some structure in place, but there's still, because of the rate of growth, there's still quite a bit of chaos. And I think, everyone's adapting. International companies are working on international standards. There are local customs which need to be taken into account and to be sensitive of how things work, but equally by still doing things transparently and legally.
Thank you for that. So you mentioned there are practical problems and streamlining problems. We know that these problems aren't isolated, they are experienced throughout the supply chain. So with the work that you're doing, how do you ensure that the needs and requirements of all parties involved in the supply chain are met?
Well, to be honest, it's hard. And I would be lying if we'd solved all the problems. But I think and believe that a big part of this is bringing visibility to what's going on. There's still a lot of competition, and competition is not a bad thing, but it is bringing visibility to all of those stakeholders, which is what we aim to do through technology, whether that's for opportunities, whether that's for tracking information, whether that's for data, whether that's for payment information, to really bring everything together in a single place. Because there are, you even have it in the tech world, in trade finance across the world, there's lots of digital islands or analog islands. And by bringing all of those together, increasing visibility and critically collaboration rather than competition. And it's an interesting thing, actually, for as long as I can remember in our business, we try and do things differently. And I suppose that's the key. Whenever someone's doing something one way, we challenge why we shouldn't do it the opposite way. And one of my favorite examples of that is, in the world today, most people spend a lot of time and energy protecting their ideas.
Yes.
And my rationale or hypothesis on this is, actually, if we are in 2024 today and we see what the world should look like in the future, if you try and put that in place today, it will be rejected because it's too much of a jump. Whereas if each baby step you make it, well, I suppose in part open source, but make it so that everyone copies you, which tends to happen, right? But actually make your business benefit from being copied because it then changes the norm. I suppose my view on how you save a lot of time and money and actually benefit everyone else by kind of sharing that information. And if you base your business on its success is if people copy what you're doing, then you save yourself a lot of time and energy.
I agree. If we can take a couple of steps back, in the introduction, we mentioned that you have a focus on the mining, construction, and heavy equipment industries. Is there a reason why you've decided to focus on these industries?
That's a really good question. And I think there's a number of reasons, some obvious, some perhaps less obvious. I think the first, as I mentioned at the beginning, I was working in l'IAE and selling used computers to schools. And actually, the way I got into selling spare parts for machines is I met some people in a restaurant getting takeaway one night, and they were really struggling to get spare parts for their machines in a cost-effective way and in a reasonable time. And I won't bore you with the backstory, but they very kindly gave me the opportunity to prove ourselves, and we did. And that's sort of how it begun. And I suppose the reason I find spare parts and machinery so interesting and relevant for Africa and the world over is they're used in most infrastructure and mining operations. So it's a product that has a very far reach. It's a product that is, reasonably high value, and it's a B2B product. So kind of by coincidence, we started in those spaces. Another sort of reason for that is I don't like comparing us to other businesses, but if you see what Amazon has done in the sort of B2C world, they started by selling books, and they did that very well, and then they expanded into other products. The way I would see that is we started with machine parts and machinery, which gives us, a good market size to prove concept, something that's traded and sold all over the world, so can take us wherever we need to be, something that's very relevant in Africa today. But ultimately, it is a product with a SKU, with an item number. So once we've kind of perfected the model for this, there's nothing stops us, and this is the aim, to replicate into other industries quite aggressively. Now, aggressively is perhaps the wrong word, but it gives us the ability to do that. I think the other reasons, particularly 20 years ago, but still more so now, the amount of infrastructure investment and development required on the African continent is enormous. And it is one of the key routes to increasing benefiting the economies of African nations. But I think mining, for me, given that we look at things from a purpose perspective, mining has a mixed reputation. On one side, there's negative reports around the mining space. On the other side, as the world pushes to move to transition energy, we need to mine more than I think man has ever mined before. Yeah. But in the context of Africa, mining, it kind of encapsulates the conflict, I think, in my mind, and also in the world somewhat, and that you have the African continent is one of the richest by resources, and yet it's one of the poorest on the surface. And, I haven't sold this, but this is part of our business aim, is to bring some balance to that, because a continent which is so rich in its resources, and yet the population is still far too many are on $2 or less a day, just seems unacceptable. And that's, I suppose, part of what we aim to do. A lot of my sort of friends who are in the sort of NGO space would question my involvement, but as I mentioned earlier, it's a necessity. And one of the cornerstone industries of the world, everything, if mining didn't exist, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And so my belief is by getting involved in difficult industries and driving positive change from the inside out is the best approach.
As you mentioned, you focused on these industries by coincidence, but now that you are in the mining and construction industry, what unique challenges do these companies face in Africa?
I mean, there are many, but I would say predominantly, particularly with the focus, and rightly so, the focus on localization, a lot of the challenge comes down to access to finance, right? So you have a lot of local contractors, sometimes operating in difficult territories, who've been awarded large subcontracts, and, whether the banks are asking for security they can't provide, or whether the banks have reached their lending limits for them. Often these companies have great contracts, but struggle to get at a fair price access to finance to be able to buy their machinery to fulfill on those projects. So I would say there are others, but I would say access to finance is one of the greatest challenges.
So how did you manage to address this challenge of access to finance through ViaTrade?
As I mentioned before, a lot of our solutions are born out of our own problems and experience. When I set up this business, I borrowed small amounts of money from my parents. I can't remember how much. They charged me interest, which I'm pleased they did, because they taught me the value of it. And, we've never taken external equity. I can relate to a lot of African entrepreneurs in that sense, because in many ways that's in similar but different ways, that's how they grow. So our biggest challenge was, we started winning some pretty major contracts with mining companies. And when we went to a bank, they're basically going, yeah, it's great you've got that contract, but if everything goes wrong, we're looking at your business and you don't have the money to repay us. And that was so frustrating, right? Because you could do all of this great work and yet you couldn't deliver on it. So around, there are various solutions that we found, but it's been so arduous, and we needed specialist teams. And, often the finances are speaking a different language to what a normal company would know. And a lot of normal companies don't have the resource, a team dedicated to this. So I suppose around 7 years ago, we started accessing export credit agency finance, which is more familiar in today's world, but used to be sort of one of the best kept secrets. It's in effect where a government or a multilateral provides a guarantee to a bank for a loan or for a facility. So Afri-Exim do a lot of work in this space. But around 7 years ago, we started working with UK Export Finance, which is the world's oldest export credit agency and the UK's export credit agency. Historically, they were very focused on large infrastructure deals and defense deals and aviation deals. But around 7 or 8 years ago, we took a transaction to them. It was actually for Ghana, which we needed help and support. And we found, although it can be a fairly long process, we found it to be incredibly beneficial because they provide a guarantee to the bank, so the bank are no longer taking risk on us or the end client. And, you know, the first transaction wasn't as smooth as any of us would have liked, I think, from all perspectives, but it gave us, you know, insight into actually to drive trade and support trade. Governments play a vital role in this. And when you do get that formula right, the benefits are huge for the exporter, which we are, for the buyer, for the bank, and for the exporting country and the host nation. So I think, you know, after doing quite a lot of these for customers around the African continent, and I can talk to some examples later if that would be helpful, we thought, actually, you know, this process is great, but it is quite long, it's quite hard, and there's different people speaking, although often all in English or all in French, they're still speaking different languages. So our aim is to kind of, through our experience and doing these transactions with the export credit agencies, is to make them simpler and quicker, because everyone wants to fill this gap. It's just hard to do. And we've found the best way to begin doing that was to do deals.
You highlighted that a lot of companies don't have specialist resources or capacity to address access to finance challenges. So the challenges that you're seeing, would you say that they're specific to a certain size of company, or are we seeing this across the board?
It's a good question. No, I think there are differences and there are nuances. And accessing international finance does have more requirements. There's environmental and social and governance requirements. There is a greater degree of transparency on financials and what assets and loans there are. So I would say the larger companies tend to be more sophisticated and well versed with this because they do have dedicated teams. And then really, I think in the sort of small, medium-sized space, it comes down to the individual teams. There are some customers we have where their finance director is incredibly responsive, incredibly detailed, incredibly open, honest, transparent, you know, all of the ideal things to make a transaction happen smoothly and quickly. I think some of the main challenges into two categories. One's business not being ready for international finance, so not having the policies and procedures, not having the detailed accounts and forecasts, which, you know, that can all be addressed. And then I say on the second one, which I sort of touched on at the beginning of this podcast, is just that culture, I suppose, and spirit of being fully open about your situation. And to be clear, this is not unique to Africa. This is SMEs all around. And I'd be lying if I hadn't been in that state before. Sometimes when you're growing and you desperately want things to happen, you're afraid that if you share something that went wrong or something that's there, that it might not happen. But the irony is, if you share all of that up front, the trust you instill in people and the ability to find solutions is much increased, because credit people are smart. People always work out if something's amiss. So my advice to any business wanting to access any finance, but particularly international finance, is put your cards on the table and, you know, be open and honest around the challenges, because then solutions can be found.
Great advice, Geoffrey. So if we look at it from the perspective of, say, local indigenous African companies, how do you believe or feel that your financial solutions enable local businesses to grow and also tap into international markets? I mean, they could be international markets on or outside of the continent.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to frame it with one case study, but I'm not going to mention the company's name just because I haven't got their permission. But it's a great local contractor in Guinea-Conakry. And brothers set it up, who are the key directors, and they won some major contracts in the country for Rio Tinto and the other major mining companies. Now, actually, I'll do them credit. It's a company called GPC. And GPC were, they'd been awarded these contracts and the local banks had reached their limits, which often happens, right? And they came to us working with one of our partners with a requirement for equipment to deliver on these projects. And praise to all parties involved. Their finance director was impeccable. Their end customers were helpful. UKF took the time to understand the deal and the transaction. And ultimately what this meant is they received 10 million worth of equipment, which they've been able to repay or are currently repaying over a period of 3 years. And as a result, they've been able to fulfill their contracts. They've now won a lot more contracts, which is terrific news. But I think one of the most impactful things for me is certainly I don't have the statistics, but the amount of people they've increased locally has increased considerably. And I forget, you probably know this better than I, but, each salary in Africa feeds many mouths. And that in itself, perhaps only a small indication, but that really shows that investing in local businesses in that way, providing the capital to do it, helps them not only grow, but also the employees and the amount of jobs that are on offer. And I think that's quite powerful. And with our clients, we tend to try and go the extra mile and mentor them as best we can and share our experience too. So they don't suffer the same mistakes we've made. So I hope that kind of answers your question. But for me, just enabling local contractors to fulfill on their contracts where they wouldn't have been able to otherwise, access cheaper funding, and by doing so, create many more jobs in the community is not the whole solution for the challenge, but it's certainly a step in the right direction.
I guess a lot of people might be listening and thinking, this sounds great, and we haven't quite explained in terms of what is the process and in terms of where do you sit in relation to the client or customer and the financial institutions, and how does it work?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would be surprised if there wasn't interest. I am going to be honest, though. It's still not easy, right? It's not free money without any ties. It has to make business sense. But to answer your question specifically, so arguably, before we started doing what we're doing, there are banks out there who will work with the ECAs. There are independent suppliers who will supply their goods and provide financing. But I suppose the role we take is we work closely with the client to prepare their submission, which we submit to UKEF, or we're spreading this to other export credit agencies now, but specifically for sort of less than 30 million, because anything above that, the big banks will take on themselves directly. So we work with the customer to get themselves ready to submit. We then manage the submission into the export credit agency and because the way the ECAs work is they issue a premium, which is basically their cost for guaranteeing the transaction. So we get it to a point where the export credit agency is happy to give an indication that they will provide support. At that point, we then work with our banking partners to identify the best funding partner, and that will depend on which country they're in, the length of the transaction, and we try and support our customers by getting them the best deal for the finance that they can do. Once that's in place, we then move to the commercial side of things, and rather than, this is the same with our Dints trading model, we don't represent any specific supplier. And the reason for that is when you represent, although you can benefit from larger margins, when you represent a specific manufacturer, you are tied to that manufacturer. And we are purposefully focused on what the client's needs are. So you take the example I mentioned earlier, there was a need for 10 million and the equipment that was required was from multiple different suppliers. And so we worked with the customer, analysed what equipment was required. Working with ECAs, there's normally a minimum content requirement for the supporting ECA. So with UKF, it's a minimum of 20%, although as they would like to say, it's a minimum, not a target. So we sort of take that list, analyse what's needed, change in where UK goods are available and accessible, and present that in tandem to the client as a commercial proposal. And either we work on a fixed price basis or a cost plus basis, depending upon what we've agreed with the customer. Now, assuming that's all acceptable, there's a commercial contract between us and the customer. And often the sub-suppliers, there's three-way communications with us and the supplier. That's the way it works best when it's fully open book. But we have a commercial contract in place with the customer. We have separate sub-agreements in place with the suppliers. And then once that's all in place, we go through the final approvals, and then the bank pays us for the goods and the customer repays the bank over time. Now, that's an oversimplified model, but hopefully that is that clear?
Very clear and concise. I know from my work in international trade and also previously working at the Department for International Trade, now the Department for Business and Trade, this can be a hugely onerous and detailed process. So how have you leveraged technology to digitize various aspects of this to make it a bit more efficient and transparent for yourself and the companies that you work with?
Indeed, and again, a great question. It's very much still work in progress, and I fear will be for some years to come. Everyone's looking at things in a different way. For example, in our transactions today, there's probably more lawyers than there need to be. Everyone's using a different resource for KYC or, know your customer details, etc. So some of this is even before we get to digital and getting all of the parties to agree to using one source of the truth. Because that, even before you get to a technological solution, saves a lot of time and money. I think the next phase is, bringing some, because a lot of ECA transactions historically were for very big transactions or for very large values, a lot of the assessments were very considered. There was a lot of consideration that went into them. And I do praise particularly UKF for still finding solutions where credits are challenging. But we're trying to make it more formulaic and working with them and the banks to submit standardized information for a standardized response. And then if it's a yes, it's much quicker. If it's a no, it still goes down the considered route, but perhaps is a little slower. So I think, to answer your question, it's begun with a lot of automation in our own systems. And at the moment, we're currently building a trade and finance sort of marketplace to enable customers to self-serve and fill in a lot of this information up front, but more importantly, break down the stages so that you submit a certain amount of information and you get an indication that it makes sense to do more, because sometimes the information can be a little bit overwhelming. So it's breaking it down into those baby steps. And, like a lot of chief product officer is always driving hard on this. Like any product, it's not about creating a digital version of an analog problem. It's actually rethinking it, and from a user experience perspective, making it as simple as possible and ensuring that information isn't entered twice, and just removing some of the fat in the process, if you will. And I think going forward, there's all kinds of exciting things that can be done in the automation realm, but a lot of things now are just getting things standardized and giving visibility of information. So you take this portal we're building, or this app we're building, the customer, us, sub-suppliers, the banks and UKF or other ECAs will have full visibility and access to the information. Now, not necessarily everyone will have all of that information, but the information that's relevant to them, which will just, removing emails from things is one very simple way to speed things up. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavour. There's some exciting things in development, but maybe we'll have to have a rematch when they're launched and I can tell you more in detail.
Definitely. It gives me a flavour, and it's great to hear about the trade finance marketplace that you're developing. So what are your thoughts in terms of the intersection of finance technology in trade? Is this the way forward? And are you positioning yourself to be a player in that landscape in terms of, I think they call it trade tech?
Yeah, trade tech, and it's, a phrase that I was familiar with quite a few years ago, but it's, fintech was all the rage. Now it's trade tech. So simply put, yes, I'm hoping that we, through our approach, are going to either directly or indirectly drive considerable change in this space. Now, when I say directly, that will be things that we do, but indirectly, it comes back to this competition point. If someone solves a problem in the industry before we get there, I don't view that as competition. I view that as a celebration that there is a business that's finding a niche and being able to capitalize on that, and something less that we have to do. I think our focus more is bringing all of these stakeholders together, and where there is a gap, filling that gap. Because as I mentioned earlier, there are some terrific innovations out there in the fintech space, whether that's digital bills of exchange now, or e-bills of lading, or, various fintech solutions. But the problem is they're not all sort of joined up. And, unless you can have the best technology, but unless you have companies using it, it's never going to get traction. And I think that's part of the benefit of having built up our trading business is for whatever technologies we develop or or companies we partner with, we have an ecosystem to test and implement those in. So I'd like to, again, it slightly comes down to my ideology of how we run the business. I believe that we will make quite a dramatic change in this space in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe sooner, just through prior experience. I'm being conservative. But some of that may be, others seeing that opportunity. We're not aiming to be the best or well, actually, let me rephrase. We are aiming to be the best at what we do, but we're not aiming to control this. We're taking a slightly different view and hoping to create a landscape and a methodology which others can adopt. And some of this is happening already. So I may have waffled on a little bit here, but in summary, yes, I see us being very prominent in this. And my hope is that we can bring together all of the great actors and either fill the gaps ourselves, or some entrepreneurs will fill those gaps so that it can work harmoniously.
I'm glad to hear that you are taking a very pragmatic and, as you say, a different view. And I guess with that comes a balance. So how do you maintain a balance between the innovation and also the reliability in terms of the technology that you're providing, the solutions that you're providing for the market?
Yeah, and again, being sort of modest on where, technology is still not nearly as developed as it can and should be. And I think the balance there is baby steps, right? I know plenty of people in the London tech space who've, taken huge amounts of investment, built loads of technology. They haven't fully got the product market fit yet. I think the fashion of valuing businesses on their losses is ending. But, a lot of these businesses have never made cash. So I suppose it's about taking your time. It's like the hare and the tortoise, right? This is not a sprint. It's a marathon driving this change. So it is baby steps. And this is why having our own trading business is so important. If it works for us, it should work for others. Now, there might be some variance, but we make sure that it works for us first. And there's still a lot of, and I'm sure there will be for a long time, a lot of human input in these to make sure it works. Slightly changing subject, but your last question prompted this thought in me. And it comes back to this. When I was in I think we can all be guilty of this a little bit, but when I was in my early 20s, I was like, I'm going to be a billionaire. It's all about the cash, all about the marketing, all about the materialist stuff. And I, don't get me wrong, I still like the nice things in life. But I do think that's part of, dare I say it, wrong with business a little bit today, because I think feeding all of that stuff and focusing on the money side can leave us a little bit hollow inside. And let's remember, money and finances is the greatest responsibility a human can have. And how you use it is so important. And I think not least probably because I'm technically middle-aged now, I've been reflecting for the last year. When I'm lying on my deathbed, Am I going to wish I had more cash? Absolutely not. What am I going to do with it? Right? There's two things that I want to look back on. I don't have a family yet, so that may change if I have a family. But the two things I want to look back on is, one, I want to have made a real positive impact in the world. And my late father said to me not long before he died, said, Geoffrey, the best way to change the world is for no one to know that you're doing it. Now, that's quite hard, but his point there was it for not to be about your ego, not to be all about you. Otherwise, you're not creating lasting change. And I think the second element when I look back on this, I want to have seen everything I want to see. And that's why I love this work in international trade. It's the second oldest industry in the world, and it lets you see the majority of the world.
Some very profound words there in terms of focusing on money can leave us hollow and impact is key. So what impact do you think the technology solutions that you're providing can have on the local economies on the continent? So,
again, a lot of these have been in my mind for many years, and I'm a little frustrated with myself. We haven't made more progress, but I'd say let me paint a simple example. Most mine sites that you go to across Africa and across the world will have a man or a lady in a 20-foot container who is selling, supplies for mining companies, and say hard hats, boots, that kind of stuff. And this is only a simple example, but it's replicable to other things. And you see, a mining company, for example, might need 3,000 pairs of steel toe cap boots. And for me, that man or woman is the perfect person because they're there, they're keen, they can, be on site. You're still enabling that human-to-human contact. And I think that's the important point. Technology is not there to replace humans, it's there to supercharge them. And if we can use that to enable that human-to-human contact or relationship, I think that will be key. But in that particular example, the reason why that company or man or lady wouldn't get that business is the mine won't pay them in advance. They don't have the cash to go and buy the goods and then offer credit. And if they had been an agent for someone offshore in the past, they probably would have done one deal and then the company offshore or the large company would have said, well, we don't need them. We can just manage it ourselves. So I think, although a little illustration there, I think one of the aims we have is to enable small businesses, individuals on a level playing field to be able to offer goods and services to, whether these are domestic companies or to export without the need for finance. And it can be structured in a way that enables them to get paid, but just their margin, the suppliers to get paid and the customer to get their payment terms. So I think a lot of it does come down to finance. I think a lot of it, the other part that comes down to it is that visibility and accessibility of information. I dare I say it without sounding too revolutionary, the democratization of trade. So if you are a one-man band, you have the same chances of a much larger business if you can do your job. Does that kind of cover your question?
Yes. I mean, you touched on a key point there in terms of technology is not there to replace people. It's there to enhance their work. We know that technology is fast moving and we're always seeing new trends emerging. Are there any key trends that you've seen in the role of, say, technology in trade tech that you're currently excited about?
Oh, that's a good question. I think, if I'm honest, there's lots of great innovations, but as I said, until you see some of them really flying, there's good ideas, but not the application. It's hard to get. I've become a little bit cynical because there's a great innovation. We had the whole blockchain craze however many years ago, and there's still value in that. But are all trade transactions blockchain today? No, because the landscape isn't kind of ready for it. So I'm normally excited about quite a lot of things, but I think there's a bit of work, and I feel that our work is a key part of this, to get it to a point where we really can get excited and really can see the big changes on this. I think, touching on what you said around the human-to-human side, I don't know about you, but anyone who sends me an out of the blue AI generated email on LinkedIn message, I have zero interest in buying anything. I have FX traders who call me up and I'm
Yeah.
getting progressive. It's just not the way to sell, right? And I think, this is where the advent of AI is going to be, I believe, tremendous for the world. There's some very high risks which we will need to get a handle on, otherwise it could go badly wrong. But I don't believe it's going to replace humans. And even before we get to the AI standard, the point of this, the reason I travel so much is I want to sit across with people, develop relationships, understand what makes them tick, share still, that human part. And I think that is so important. We are all human. And I think in some ways we might have lost some of our humanness in the last few decades because we've been through such a change. So it's rediscovering that and embracing that human to human interaction, but taking away the mundane things, and to do things that machines do better and quicker for us. So yeah, I don't have any specific things in the trade tech space I'm super excited about at the moment, because I think just a few of them need to come together and actually become really impactful and get some real traction.
I know you mentioned that you've become cynical about trade tech trends, but how do you keep yourself informed ahead of the trends and I guess adapt so that you stay ahead in the space?
That's a good question. So I think I'll answer that personally and then from the company perspective. So actually, I'll do the company first. So I'm lucky that in our team, everyone is, we don't catch everything, but everyone's pretty much up to speed on what's being done. And a lot of stuff's being done in Europe, some good stuff being done in Africa. So the team keep me abreast of things. But the main way I keep abreast, coming back to that point, is by traveling and seeing what the challenges and opportunities are and talking to people. And that is, and also as our trading business, using them and finding them. I mean, if we have a problem, we try and find a solution. If the solution isn't there, we consider whether we're going to attack that as a future product. So I think for me personally, it's talking to people. I have to confess, I start from a kind of first principles thought on a lot of these things, and I try, rather than by looking at what is there first, I shape the thoughts and vision of what we want to do without any kind of barriers, and then see what exists out there to complement that.
Perfect. I like that response. Keeping it real, Geoffrey. So moving from trends and looking at the future, Africa's future, where do you see Africa in 5 years' time with regards to its use of technology to facilitate or enhance global trade?
I see it at the forefront. Now, there are certain things that need to happen for that to be a reality, but I think one of the many reasons I started my business on the African continent is, there's, in many ways, because there are many challenges, it's much easier to innovate solutions. So I actually believe if the mentality of people is aligned for, let's say, the greater good, Africa has the potential to be the key innovation hub, where technologies are tried, tested, developed, and then exported around the world once there is traction. And if you look at the demographics of Africa, if you look at the opportunities going forward, I think there is a very real chance that it could be at the forefront of that. Now, there would be many cynics in my world, particularly older generations who've worked on the African continent for many years, who would say, it might be tough for that to ever happen. And don't get me wrong, there are challenges, but I think it's mainly one of mindset. But yeah, I mean, you look at something like mobile pay. I mean, I don't know my stats here, but mobile pay was being used ages before in Africa than we probably adopted it in Europe. And you look at the leapfrogs that have come in the cell phone revolution, no fixed infrastructure. All of these things can change very rapidly. So I'm very hopeful. Like I said, I think there are some challenges, but technology itself may address them.
Fantastic. So looking closer to home, where do you see yourself, ViaTrade, Dints in 5 years' time? What role will you be playing on the continent in terms of promoting trade in Africa and beyond?
That's a great question. So for me personally, interestingly, I'm trying to, so that we are truly a company rather than, Jeff's group of people doing good things. I'm trying to make myself redundant from the business. That's not to say I won't do anything, but it's to demonstrate that the business can not only operate but thrive without me. And the simple way of doing that is whenever you employ anyone, employ someone who is much, much better than you at something. Right. And it's hard to do that as a founder sometimes because maybe you feel threatened. But that, in my opinion, is the only way for it to go from being a sort of founder-led business to being a true business. So that's my kind of personal journey. And I'm going through that at the moment. And I'm lucky I've got an amazing team around me who have my trust. And some really exciting things are happening. And so for me personally, that will probably enable me to probably do what I do best, travel the world and I suppose selling, but getting people excited and bought into the idea of what we're doing and growing that network. In terms of our businesses themselves, Dints is a trading business today. I see it going from strength to strength. And over the next couple of years, I do really see Via's impact becoming quite profound. And again, if people choose to copy us, that's fantastic. But my main aim here is actually to bring everyone together, right? Because working together always results in greater success than just working in our own isolation.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And I look forward to seeing how things develop. And I hope you get to travel as much and as often as you please in the near future. So the next question is the last one.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quote, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
That's a terrific question. I might have reeled some of them off. I do have loads of them, but whether one can immediately come to mind, I'd say it probably comes down to what I said just now, which is, collaboration results in greater success than working on your own. It is working with people. And I think kind of related to that, it is, a lot of the challenges in the world and in ourselves are driven by fear. So it is really, conquering that fear and doing it anyway.
Brilliant. I agree 100%. And I guess that's a mantra for most business people, entrepreneurs, founders to follow. As we come to the end of today's conversation, I was wondering if you have any closing remarks, final calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you're doing.
That's very kind. I think closing remarks would be, if anything I've said today is helpful, please feel free to get in touch with us. Whether we can help you or not directly, we'll always do our best to signpost. As I hope you've sensed, I'm incredibly passionate about purposeful business and supporting entrepreneurs in their journey and in international trade. So I hope those of you who share that passion, interest or excitement have benefited from today. And I will work on some more mantras as well. I feel I didn't do it for full justice, but I'll keep you posted on those. But I also want to thank you so much for having me on today. It's a real honour and privilege, and I'm just super excited about this space and hoping we can do it justice in the coming years.
Fantastic. What a way to end today's conversation. Thank you, Geoffrey. It's been a great conversation. Some valuable insights and hearing how you're leveraging technology, finance, logistics to facilitate global trade. Very enlightening, and it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.